Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us today. We're having people filter in still through the waiting room, but I thought we should start as it's 6:02. So my name is Hayley Braun. I'm the Director of Women at AGSM's Student Association, and I would love to begin tonight by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land in which I am currently speaking to you from today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I recognise their continued connection to the land and waters of this beautiful place and acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So there are more enslaved people today than at any other time in history. The International Organization for Labour estimates that more than 40 million people are trapped in modern slavery today, with almost 3/4 of them being women and girls. That's one victim of modern slavery for every 200 people in the world. But what is modern slavery? For many, the mention of slavery may conjure up images of people in shackles or the millions of people stolen from their lands and forced into slave labor by the British and Europeans during the period of the transatlantic slave trade. But modern slavery is a hidden crime that affects every country in the world. As Walk Free, an international human rights group focused on the eradication of modern slavery, states, modern slavery refers to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, and/or the abuse of power. It has been found in many industries, including garment manufacturing, mining, agriculture, and in many contexts, from private homes to settlements for internally displaced people and refugees. Modern slavery impacts all of us, from the food we consume to the goods that we purchase. And while many of us might like to imagine that modern slavery is a distant problem, it is happening even here on Australian soil, most notably in our fresh food supply chain. In this panel discussion, we will consider the role of Australian business and that can play in eradicating modern slavery. Our panellists will share their first-hand experiences tackling modern slavery, as well as their innovative ideas and recommendations on what can be done to break the cycle once and for all. Tonight's discussion will begin with a keynote presentation, which will be followed by a panel discussion and finally finished up with a short Q&A. For anyone interested in posing any questions to our panelists, please use the Slido link, which Jono will now post in the chat. I think he's previously posted it. He can post again as well. First of all, it is my pleasure to introduce Kalpona Akter, our keynote speaker for the evening. At 12 years old, Kalpona started working in a garment factory in Bangladesh. Since then, she's become a leading campaigner for worker safety, fair wages, and the right to labour unions. Kalpona is a recipient of the prestigious Human Rights Watch Award for extraordinary activism and has been a key player in urging Western brands to sign on to the Bangladesh Safety Accord following the Rana Plaza collapse in 2013. She is the founder and executive director for the Bangladesh Centre for Worker Solidarity, and we have the absolute pleasure of having her here with us tonight. Welcome, Kalpona. Thank you so much for joining us. And Kalpona, over to you.
Thank you so much, Holly. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. To your evening though, it is afternoon in here in Dhaka. So it is well explained that what is the modern slavery look like in 21st century today. And I wanted to connect you, with the modern slavery 30 years back when I started working, or just to share with you that one need to be a campaigner or a union activist who started working at 12 years old in the factory. So starting in a factory in that age, definitely it wasn't my choice, it was a need. My dad was the primary earner in the family, so he got ill and there wasn't anyone who can bring food in the table. And we were 5 siblings. and my parents. So my mom, she started working in the factory, but she had to quit within 2-3 months because we had a baby sister at home and she needed to take care of her. And her wage wasn't adequate, so she couldn't, hire a babysitter and sending us to school in the same time. She used to make really poor wages. So she sent me, and then my 10 years old brother also joined with me in the factory. So two of us was breadwinner for the family in those days. My working life was, I was making $6 a month, working over 400 hours in a month. So that was the life. Toiling my life in that sweatshop factory, though it wasn't only me, there was many other children who was working in that time. And we had to go through all these because we didn't know there is a law that's supposed to protect us. So we were like kind of slave. I would be stood up in my feet for 18 hours and working. I couldn't say no to any long shifting work. The slap over the face or throwing the merchandise in our body, it was very common by the supervisor in those days. So, the trend became when the management wanted to pay us even less amount of money than we were making in that factory, and the protest started without even knowing the law and rights. And I was among 90. There was a 93 striker, the frontline striker, who called a strike in the factory, and I was only one female young worker who joined with them. It's not that I know that I have to protest and I know the law. It was because I don't want to lose that money. I had a plan with money to buy a new clothes or a good food for my brother and sisters. So I joined with them. We only strike, but the management started brutally, torture towards us. In the first hand, many of them lost their job. And then I came to know there is an organization who teaching the law and rights. I went there for 4 hours. It was a 4-hour long level of training, which changed my entire life. I consider it's a second born for me because there is only I came to know my work shift supposed to be 8 hours. I have right to say no to any extra overtime. I cannot be forced to do the overtime. The supervisor cannot slap on my face. And among many things, something beautiful I came to know, that I have right to organize and right to bargain. And I started organizing in the factory from the following morning and sharing all detail what I learned from the training class with my all young and child co-workers. And everyone was fascinated to hear that we have right to organize and right to bargain. But that did not lead to know, because as soon as the management came to know, we joined with union, they started firing us. So lately, I have been fired and blacklisted throughout the industry. So my life became miserable. I didn't get job anywhere as I have been blacklisted. So I became a union organizer as a full-timer. I consider it's a stupid decision that management ever has taken. They shouldn't have fired me. I could organize only in one factory, 1,500 workers, but now I'm speaking on behalf of 4 million workers, those are working here in Bangladesh, and many more in other production countries. So it's a great opportunity they created for me and my co-workers in production countries, so I could campaign for them. So my activism basically to stop slavery in this industry. This is, what it has been promoted me to do. And, more, I think I will say that what inspired me, why I'm continuing doing this. But before I go there, I wanted to share that even today, how the fashion industry or how the garment industry look like here in Bangladesh. Our workers is still receiving a poverty wages. The monthly wages, minimum wage is $85 a month, which is not enough for one full month cost, let alone if they have children at home. over 30% or more, they need to use for their housing. And it's not a dream house. It's a 10 feet by 10 feet concrete room, sometimes which doesn't have window. And they share toilet and kitchen with another 20 families. And if we count the person, so 80% get access to 2 toilets, which is, I mean, it's unimaginable from, some part of the world. They cannot even think that how these women are living who is making clothes for them. So this is one area. And when still our workers do not have, in document, in book, they do have right to say no to the overtime, or there should not be any forced work, but reality, they don't have right to say no to forced work. They are forced to do the overtime. And sometimes they want to do too, because they wanted to add more money with their wages, because their wages is not enough for their monthly cost. So the only making is that they do overtime and then it's counted. There is enormous gender-based violence exists in these factories. We don't have any law, we just have a rules, and that doesn't give a protection for our women workers. Even that the rules, high court rules can give a protection if that would be enforced in the factories, but it is not. The ILO Convention 190 to eliminate gender-based violence from the work of the world, not been ratified by our country yet. What happened when our workers raised voice and tried to organize union in their factory? It did not change my time to now. The workers is still threatened, beaten, forcibly charged whenever they try to organize, even they're forced to leave the community. And this all happens because of the power collusion. Because in our parliament, over 30% of them are who directly own group of garment factory. A handful number of ministers who directly own garment factory in here. So when your legislator is your factory owner, you can think of a very minimum change for our workers. And that is what we are going through. In the last couple of years, or 8 years precisely, 8 years back, many people in the world came to know about Bangladesh due to Rana Plaza disaster, a man-made disaster, which was absolutely preventable. But again, the modern slavery come here. When workers saw the crack in the building, they denied, but they have been forced to go to the factory and work. So the Rana Plaza, many people say it's a wake-up call and safety needed to be changed, but it wasn't, because that wasn't only accident. There was many accidents that we have been faced, and we lost hundreds of our colleagues during those accidents. And every single one of them was preventable. But Rana Plaza, it was because the number of the death was huge in any manufacturing sector in the world. It was 1,138 workers who died, who lost their lives. And then the brand and retailers came together and made a commitment. They signed a binding agreement, which has made a phenomenal change in here. But that does not apply for whole industry. We can say out of 4 million, 2.2 million workers are working in a safe workplace, but rest yet in an unsafe workplace, because still there is a voluntary auditing system. There is a voluntary mechanism which does not give any promise to making changes in those areas of safety. And then when we all already have all these problems, then we have the COVID, which has made the situation more vulnerable. In our country, we don't have social protection for people. We don't have any social security. On top of that, we don't have any unemployment insurance. So when COVID pandemic started, the first hit was our workers. So thousands of workers lost their job in a very first hand, without any severances, without any single sense. They had to go back where they started from. The brands, they showed their irresponsible behavior in the same time. Rather holding up these workers back, they all started either postponing or, or canceling their orders. And many brands was top of that. I mean, they were like denying to pay the bill, and the manufacturers got an excuse to say, oh, if we don't get bill, we will be not able to pay your wages. So the workers only got their wages when the government step up and given a stimulation package. So it's a huge, bulk amount the government has to give to these manufacturers to ensure that workers have wages. But the workers, even, there are few tier of factories, like the subcontract factory workers did not get any money. So they were literally starving with their children at home. It was over 300,000 workers who lost their job during this pandemic, only from garment industry, let alone the other industry. And everyone went through the same fate. There wasn't no severances for them. There was no economic safeguard for them. They were literally starving. And many of them, thousands of them, yet couldn't come back to the industry because the industry is not running in the same scale before, like it would be before pandemic. So what we learned from this COVID, that we need a responsible business. The business needs to be rewrite. When we are, speaking with our manufacturers, trying to bring them or making them accountable, we need to, accountable to these brands as well who are sourcing from our country. They have equal responsibility. Our workers not making profit only for manufacturers, for brands as well. So they do have equal responsibility to respond in this time. So it is a high time for the sourcing country to have, or to have a due diligence law and bringing these brands under an accountable position. So our workers yet, suffering because our workers, we never want that worker to give a charity. We don't want charity. We just want during this COVID, we want to get our severances. We want our workers should covered by the social protection. And we want that our workers should be covered by the unemployment insurance. We don't want anyone to extend their hand and say, oh, we have a food bank. No, we want it to work and we want it to earn it. We want a dignified wage. We don't want any charity. So my call for action through this panel or this event today. I know there are many of you students, many of you from business group, many of from NGOs. So not only in Bangladesh, in other production country, we are giving our voice pretty much same thing at this moment. We really need a living wage for us. The minimum wage is not enough for us to live in. We want the brands to add GVB as a zero tolerance in their code of conduct, and that has to be enforced. I'm calling all the brands. I know many Australian brands has been signed, but who did not, please sign the international accord. Accord save lives, not Mirapon, not any other corporate self-regulatory. The Accord has made a phenomenal change in here. As an activist, I'm telling this with a guarantee. So please do sign the Accord and make workers' life safe. And to the consumers, I know that many of you are consumers as well. So my voice to all consumers, I know that when you hear about this sweatshop, when you hear that workers are working in a hardship, the first thing comes to your mind that should we buy or we shouldn't buy? You are in a dilemma. My voice is very loud and clear that not buying is not the solution. The workers, we are here, we need these jobs, but we want them with dignity. We have been speaking a lot for a lot of things, but it is a time to ensure that we have our jobs with dignity. And to understanding giving a living wage, it's not a rocket science to calculate, okay? It's pretty easy. So the thing is that whether you wanted to do it or not, if you want to do it, we are here to discuss. We are here to sit down in a table and discuss and find a way out. So I wanted to stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any question you have. Thank you, and I apologize if I have taken much time that I allocated. Thanks.
Thank you, Kalpona. Not at all. Thank you so much for sharing your powerful story with us. And really, I love the call to action for consumers. Not buying is not the solution. Responsible buying is, and ensuring that in the supply chain that people are provided jobs with dignity. As you said, it's not rocket science. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for helping to set the tone of tonight's discussion. So next, it is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Lake, who is the Director of Social Impact for the AGSM Student Association, and who is also our panel moderator for this evening. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Hayley and Kalpona. Wow, it's such a privilege to hear your story, and I think everyone here is so grateful that you could join us and share your experience with us today. And to all of you here who've joined this virtual panel discussion, thank you. As you're probably aware by now, tackling modern slavery is an incredibly complex challenge. Millions are affected by this phenomenon and are also involved in it. And I think the best hope we have at finding a better way of doing business, a fairer way of doing business, is if we combine all of our expertise and experiences, perspectives and abilities to solve this problem together. And that's why it's so great to see so many different people here from different sectors and backgrounds, really interested in figuring out the solutions to this wicked challenge. So on that note, I think it's time we dive into the discussion. And just to give you an idea of how we're going to structure the call or the virtual discussion, I'll introduce the panelists in a moment, and we'll have a discussion for around 40 minutes. And then after that, we'll allow some Q&A time. So there's a lot to talk about, and like Kalpona said, she's open for questions afterwards, and I'm sure you've got plenty for her. And as Hayley mentioned, we've just sent through the Slido link, so if you want to ask questions, just check out the chat box below and you can ask questions that way. So joining Kalpona tonight, we have 3 additional panelists who you can probably see here on the screen already. They're each working to overcome the challenge of modern slavery in their own right. First up, Professor Justine Nolan of the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW Sydney and the Australian Human Rights Institute. Justine was instrumental in the development of Australia's Modern Slavery Act, which took effect in January 2019. We'll learn a little more about the effectiveness of the Act to date and how businesses are adapting to the requirements outlined in the legislation. Welcome, Justine. Normally we would hear a round of applause in a real life situation.
I can imagine it. Thank you, Rebecca.
Next, it's my pleasure to introduce James Bartle, former freestyle motocross rider turned entrepreneur. James is the CEO of Outland Denim, an Australian fashion company on the vanguard of the socially conscious manufacturing movement. Outland's mission is built around clothing being a solution to the cycle of poverty. Last year, the brand was awarded the Thomson Reuters Stop Slavery Award, a testament to Outland's commitment to pay above living wages and to provide sustainable employment and career progression to hundreds of Cambodian women. We'll learn a little more about what makes Outland's business model so different and what else James is working on to challenge the status quo in the global fashion supply chain. Welcome, James. And finally, I'm really pleased to introduce Richard Williams, an AGSM MBA alumni who is now at the cutting edge of supply chain transparency and intelligence. Richard's firm Precision Solutions Group exists to combat critical social issues, including modern slavery, through enhanced intelligence solutions. Richard is currently working with James at Outland on an innovative initiative designed to map and engage workers at the earliest stages of the fashion supply chain, all the way down to cotton farmers. Welcome, Richard. Virtual clap for you. So let's jump into the discussion. I want to start with James, and maybe we'll take a little back step. I think some people will be interested in your story. Could you tell us how one goes from being a freestyle motocross rider to social impact entrepreneur / anti-slavery activist?
Yeah, well, hey, everybody. Thanks for taking some time out of your evening to join us. And it's definitely a privilege to be able to join you guys. Look, my journey is slightly obscure, and it all started with going to the movies with my wife on a date night to watch the movie Taken. Liam Neeson was the hero of that movie. It's a fictional film. But at the end of it, the film being about his daughter and friend being abducted and sold into the sex industry, there was some script that came up and said that these things still happen around the world. And I was so naive at the time to the reality of human trafficking and slavery. But I remember leaving that night just being outraged by the reality. And I remember saying to my wife as we're walking away, we're walking through Coolangatta on the Gold Coast, and I'm saying, I'm going to do something about this. Like, I'm going to start some kind of vigilante group to go and kill these bad people. And my wife quickly reminded me I don't have the combat skills Liam Neeson has, and that it needed to be a different kind of strategy. My wife's a journalist, and so over the next few years, she continued to just educate me on the reality of human trafficking and how big this problem was. And, you know, I was slowly being moved to this tragedy that was just unfolding every single day for families around the world. And I was at a music festival, and I was there to perform as a freestyle motocross rider. And at the event, there was an advocacy group and that specialized in the identification and rescue, as well as advocating for victims that had been enslaved. And they asked if I wanted to go and see what they did on the ground. And, you know, I was somewhat reluctant, but obviously eager to, I guess, understand more. And it was on that trip through Southeast Asia that I witnessed a young girl for sale. And, you know, she was obviously young, 12 or 13 years old. They seemed to think, and just the fear and intimidation that I could see in her face, in her eyes, was just one of those moments that was so overwhelming, of just wondering, you know, like, what was going to happen to her that night. And I asked the guy that had sort of taken me to see it all, and he said, James, it looks like it might be her first night, and she was there to be sold for sex. And at that moment, you know, I had two nieces at the time. You know, everything in you wants to be the Liam Neeson. You want to run in and you want to kick the door down, throw over your shoulder, and save the day. And, you know, he was very quick to remind me that, you know, if I was to look around, that these young girls are everywhere, in every country, in every corner of the globe. And we left there, and it was one of those moments in your life that everything changes. It was, yes, you can read about it, and yes, you can see it in a movie or in a newspaper, but when you see the look in someone's eyes like that, and then you relate that to somebody who you love, you know that you have to do something. And her face has stayed with me all of these years. This is 10 years ago that this happened now. And I'm committed today as I've ever been, to wanting to find an end to, you know, this obscene momentum that this trade is gaining. You know, it's a $150 billion industry. And I believe that the solution is going to be found in business. And Kalpona's story is just so inspiring, and gives us, you know, so much insight into the realities. And our business has been something that has identified that business, that brands can be the solution to the 40 odd million slaves around the world.
And just on that, James, you mentioned the momentum, and I think this is something that people might need to take a breath to think about. The fact that you started Outland, I think it's 10 years ago now, and actually that's around the same time when I was reporting on modern slavery as the journalist in Southeast Asia. But the momentum, so this problem's only gotten worse in 10 years' time. As someone who, you know, you're working in supply chains, you work in the fashion industry, do you have any insight into why this is the case? Like, why is it getting worse?
Look, I believe it's getting worse because of culture. You know, I saw signs that were held up in Kalpona's presentation there of brands that have actually been responsible for eroding culture, for educating us. You know, I actually think we're victims in lots of ways. We've been manipulated to believe that the cost of a product is so low, that what goes into making a product is insignificant, and therefore we should be able to have 10 pairs of jeans, one of every color, and they're disposable. And I think it's this slow erosion of our culture over time that has meant that it's created so many more opportunities for vulnerable families around the world to be exploited. And we're just talking about not just the garment sector, but we're talking about across food and all products. And there's this pursuit of, I want it, I want better quality, I want more of it, and I want it less, And so our job now is to re-educate our communities to understand the realities of what a product costs. And Kalpona mentioned there that we just want to be paid minimum of living wages, and that the dignity is put back in their work. And I mean, that is the bare minimum for humanity. And so this is a massive humanitarian crisis that deserves attention from every business and every body, government body or authority on the planet. And if we don't do something drastic, this thing will continue to gain momentum. But I'm very hopeful at the same time that there is some solutions, and I'm excited to talk about those tonight.
It's great. And so James has talked about the solutions, that business can do, especially businesses that have a social purpose kind of wrapped around their mission. I'd like to turn to Justine now and look at the policy perspective. So as I mentioned previously, Justine, you are a leading advocate for Australia's Modern Day Slavery Act, and you're actually currently in the midst of undertaking research to examine the first tranche of annual statements submitted by Australian companies to the Modern Day Slavery Registry. Could you just give us like a high level overview of what Australia's Modern Slavery Act is and what the expectations are for businesses?
Sure, and thanks for having me for this great discussion tonight. So in 2018, after sort of a couple of years of agitation and government inquiries, the Australian government passed the Modern Slavery Act, and it went into effect in 2019. And what it does is it requires companies who have more than $100 million in annual revenue each year to report and publicly submit a statement to the government Modern Slavery Register. So you can search that, and you can go now and have a look at more than 4,000 statements that are online in relation to it. And the Act basically sets out a number of issues that companies have to answer in their report. And it asks things like about, sort of what policies do you have? What's your process for identifying modern slavery? What's your risk management measure? And, what are you doing to address this problem largely? And there's no real, these reports are sort of fairly loose. So there's criteria you have to answer, but they come in all sorts, shapes and styles. But the theory behind the law is that by shining a spotlight on the problem, sort of sunlight's the best disinfectant, if you like. So while James is right in saying that the problem is getting worse, but it's also the fact that we're actually uncovering more information about the problem than we knew 10 years ago. So that's a good thing. So, there's this balance for business in basically identifying that there is modern slavery in their supply chain, which is a good thing to identify, because until you highlight the problem, you can't fix it. So it is that sort of old metric that you get, throws at you at business school all the time. What you can't measure doesn't matter. What you can't measure, you can't monitor. So a big emphasis around this type of law is around transparency and disclosure. Having said that, it's a law which focuses on that education, awareness and spotlight, but not a lot on accountability and liability. So it's short on sort of the fact of, if companies don't do this, how might we enforce a change? Or if they do identify it, how do we make them remediate the problem? How do we make them address it? And the Act doesn't do any of that. So there's various laws that are emerging around the world at the moment. Australia's, the United Kingdom, California, and the EU in particular is focusing a lot on corporate transparency as one of these issues. But the laws themselves are sort of half the picture, because the state, the government can set the policy, but it also should enforce it. And our law falls short in that. And you have to think about, how do you get business to follow the law? You have to both incentivize them to do it, and then if they don't do it, hold them accountable. And that's where sort of the law is missing. So it's got, where Australia's at the moment is we've got one part of the picture. We've raised a lot of awareness and education, and companies who didn't know what modern slavery was 3 years ago are now actively trying to understand it and adapt their policies to actually identify cases. But we have a long way to go. So I'd say it's one step forward, but it's by no means the sort of magical solution at the moment.
And that's a perfect segue into asking Richard more about what you do, Richard, with Precision Solutions Group, because like Justine said, now there's a legislation, but what happens when businesses actually identify that there is modern slavery in their supply chain? Like, how you help them uncover it, but what's the next step in that process?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, it's a great question, and one that a lot of people struggle with. And I've certainly had a number of conversations on this exact topic with James before. And as people start on this journey, I think it's something that they need to think about early. But I guess the key message from my perspective is when you uncover it, it's to engage with it. It's not to turn off the supply contract, not to look somewhere else, but to actually actively engage and step up and actually, fulfill that role and sort of realize the potential that the private sector has and businesses have in actually having a positive impact in creating change for good. Now, I think that is the key message, and there is that natural instinct for people to actually just go elsewhere, turn that contract off. We're going to go to a different supplier and think that that's going to have the impact. And as sort of, it's an extension, I think, of what Kalpona was talking about, and not buying is not the solution, and just turning off a contract and walking away from a supplier is not the solution either. And when you are engaging them, there's a number of factors. I think first and foremost needs to be, looking after the people, the victims, and and having that impact. I think there is then a strong business requirement, obviously, for the brands themselves. How do they maintain that? How do they, how do they maintain their brand? How do they, work with the supplier? Then there's the supply side of it as well. And you're all, MBA students on the line tonight and through that program, and it's understanding, how do you change the business model? How do you understand? Let's work to understand what's created this situation, because there's multiple factors that come to play here. It's not just pure evil wanting to do bad, but it might be sometimes suppliers are squeezed down, the margins are squeezed down, and they're forced to take shortcuts, and they got short-term contracts, and they have significant cash flow issues and all these other business elements that really do come to the fore for the suppliers that they're grappling with on a day-to-day basis. So understand those, and then how do you work with them? Can you provide longer-term contracts? Can you, work together to ease some of the cash flow considerations or concerns they have? And then there's obviously a government component as well, and working collaboratively with local government, law enforcement, and also broader government to have a broader systemic change. And obviously what they do on any given day is going to depend on a number of things. Certainly the nature of the transgression. If something is immediately life-threatening, to the people working in those facilities, then a different response is needed. And that's when there's government response, and law enforcement would come to the fore, and it might be a different solution. But typically, as we've heard from Kalpona, this presents in very different ways where there is a strong commercial solution, and that's where businesses need to step up.
Do you find in your work, Richard, these supply chains are so vast and transparency is a big issue, and that's what you're helping businesses to do, is to kind of uncover some of these problems in the supply chain? Do you think it's also a matter of businesses, in production companies and workers like Kalpona not being able to speak to the other people who are managing the brands in various other countries? There's a disconnect between different stakeholders throughout the supply chain, and then they're not kind of speaking to each other and not really understanding what each other is challenged with?
Definitely. Yeah, and that's probably the crux of the problem we've been working on with James and Outland Denim is bridging that divide and actually understanding what's occurring and hearing directly from workers on the ground, external to the traditional sort of supply chain path. And so that's really given us a lot of transparency that we can put a lot of trust in, and also getting that information and actually hearing directly from the workers has then given us the information and the evidence we need to then go back and engage suppliers properly. Because, as we'll all appreciate, there's a million different conflicting priorities on anyone's desk on any given day. But to bring this to the fore, we really need that evidence to be able to say, this is happening here. Like, I can show you that it is occurring. Now let's start the serious conversation about what do we do about it? How do we work together to resolve issues and create some lasting change?
And so I want to go back to Kalpona and talking about the Rana Plaza terrible accident, like a very horrific tragedy that happened. And I'm not sure if everyone on this call actually is aware of what happened in 2013. And I know you mentioned it in your discussion, but I think it's important to highlight, like, this, while there were so many different instances that happened leading up to Rana Plaza and even after Rana Plaza, it was this event that kind of really put modern slavery back on into the headlines, at least for a little while, right, Kalpona? And I'd love to hear a bit more about your perspective about what happened to the way brands had to respond to this issue after this particular incident. And I've got some numbers here for anyone who might have missed or hasn't heard about it. You know, over 1,132 people were killed in this industrial accident, and it injured more than 2,500 people. And it was this point where brands could no longer say that they didn't know or care about how their workers were being treated at the other end of the supply chain. So it'd be great to learn more, Kalpona, exactly what happened after this accident, and whether you think the particular accord that was implemented, the Accord on Fire and Building Safety, went far enough, and how you're working with stakeholders to kind of strengthen it.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, we all know now that what happened to Rana Plaza, but how we make this brand responsible, that was really a critical way. You know that 8 years ago, not necessarily that every brand has disclosed their supplier list. So transparency was a big issue. So we found, like, me and my co-workers literally need to dig at that building after collapse to find out the logo and documentation to find that who were the brands was sourcing from that factory. So then we identified brands, but we were already in a campaign for brands to sign in an agreement prior to Rana Plaza. So there was a fire accident happening back 2010 in a factory where the 30 workers had to jump from 9th-story building. They thought they're saving their life, but they jumped to death because during lunch break, the doors was closed. So no one can escape. So that was, that has given us to discuss this, that we need to bring the other dimension as well. Like, the manufacturers here is only not responsible, the brands has responsibility as well. So we together with global NGOs and global union and local unions, we wrote a document called Agreement on, to prevent fire and building safety, to improve the fire and building safety in Bangladesh. So we were doing this campaign, but only 2 brands were signing. So one of them was PBH, Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein, and other one was Chigo from Germany. These 2 brands have signed prior to Rana Plaza and prior to Tazreen Fashion Fire. Like 6 months before Rana Plaza happened, there was another horrified fire happening in a factory called Tazreen Fashion, which killed 112 workers. Every single one was burned to ash because the doors was locked during the emergency. And more painful if you know that why they keep close the doors, because the manufacturers thinks or the management thinks that during the emergency, the workers will be steal the merchandise from the factory. So they keep, locking the workers in the factory. So our workers cost, their value is less than a merchandise. Anyways, so let's come where we are. When Rana Plaza happened, our ongoing campaign has really scaled up. That has been galvanized because everyone had to understand that time that with all these voluntary or corporate or self-regulatory will be not saving this factory or will not save these factories or workplaces or will not save the workers' lives. So we called all the brands with a given deadline that May 15th, 2013 is your time to sign this legally binding agreement, which we named later Accord on Bangladesh Fire and Building Safety. So the previous 2 brands and then the H&M and others started signing before the deadline. This is how, the accord, it came in reality. So accord is a phenomenon because it is binding. It includes workers during the inspections.
No, I think we might have lost Kalpona there. Hopefully she's able to come back in. That's okay. We'll get her back in when she is back. I just looking at what Kalpona was talking about in terms of like the brand's responsibilities as well, and signing up to legally binding legislation. I wanted to go back to you, James, and I've seen in the media recently, you recently voiced your concerns about the latest Baptist World Aid annual ethical fashion report. And for some people on this call who aren't aware of what that is, it's basically like an industry assessment of various brands in Australia and beyond, how they're abiding by various ethical and labor and sustainability standards. And the report ranked, of course, Outland Denim very highly, as high as you can get on the report, but it was alongside various fashion brands, including large fast fashion players, big brands that I'm sure many of you probably know, including H&M and Adidas. And James, in some of the reporting or the opinion piece I read of yours, you claim that many of these brands, their business models aren't like kind of created in a way that enables them to be paying living wages. Like it's impossible for them to kind of be equated in the same way as a brand like Outland, which is like mission is dedicated to improving people's livelihoods. So my question then is, like, at what point does purpose-driven business become marketing and spin? And how can consumers be expected to know the difference? And how do we sort of like interpret these standards?
Yeah, well, Rebecca, it's it was a bit of a disappointment really to, I guess, be watching the report and the way that it's constructed. But first of all, I just want to, highlight that I'm a huge advocate of the work that the Baptist World Aid Ethical Fashion Report and their team do. I think that they have actually moved our industry in the right direction, no question. And they focus on big brands and trying to encourage big brands predominantly in the right direction in incorporating better standards for workers predominantly. And they've also started assessing different attributes brands will have around environmental sustainability as well. My concern around the report is that you can see here with the slide we've got up, you can see a number of A+ brands. Next line down is an A, and you've got some brands in there that absolutely would rate up there. But you've got brands like H&M and Zara and others that would absolutely are responsible for negative cultural change. I spoke about this as soon as we launched. Now, in saying that, I'm not saying what their standards are today or are not today, but what I'm saying is that if this is going to be used as a guide, it's concerning to me that consumers would look at the kind of rating from an F to an A+. Anything from a C and better would, to me, say that absolutely I can feel okay because they pass. I can feel okay about purchasing from this brand because this brand will align with my own personal values. But unfortunately, the rating system isn't constructed that way. And so it's absolutely misleading to any of us that are looking at this for a guide on how to purchase. Now, if you go in and you look at some of the scores that H&M and Zara and others got in worker empowerment, they weren't satisfactory. They were low, and they are based off of a lot of lack of evidence of living wages. And for me, that should be an automatic fail across the entire thing. If their living wages are not paid, or if you don't have proof that living wages are paid, then there's no question that this is actually highly detrimental to this movement of ethical fashion and wanting to have better standards for our workers throughout our supply chains. And for that reason, I'm calling for the Baptist World Aid to remove the report. And I know that that's bold, and who am I to ask such a thing? But I actually see this as an erosion of every brand that's out there, every movement, every one of us that's out here trying to fight for this cause. It's an absolute erosion to our work. And in fact, it's now fallen into the category of greenwashing. It's a non-intended consequence. This isn't because the team at the Ethical Fashion Report are doing anything but trying to fight the same battle as us. And I think what we need to really realize in these situations is, or acknowledge in these situations, is that unintended consequence is a result of progress a lot of the time. For us to progress, we've got to try new things, we've got to do things, and sometimes we make a mistake. And I would say that this is one example of a mistake that's been made. I've made plenty in my own business and in my own pursuit of freedom for the people. So I'm not coming from a place of condemnation to them, more of a place of concern. And I'd love to see them remove it and show that kind of humility and, that we are a team together to try and solve this same issue. So I guess hopefully that's enough insight into the dangers of this kind of reporting.
And we don't have insight into like exactly how much these brands are paying their laborers in, far off countries. But would you say, as a guest, the majority aren't paying living wage at this point?
Well, I think something that, there's some statistics floating around at the moment, and that would say that 2% of government workers are paid a living wage, 2%.
And from your experience, like, as we know, Outland pays, above living wage standards. Is that difficult to implement as, a business, an international business that's trying to sell products to consumers who are fussy about prices? Like, is there a reason why these companies can't pay a living wage?
Yes, there is. There is a reason why they can't pay a living wage. There's a couple. First one starts with, in my opinion, the heart of the leaderships within those organizations. I don't care that somebody is suffering for the sake of my business. I mean, that is fundamentally the core problem. And until that changes, I don't believe that anything lasting will change unless it's enforced. Secondly, the business model isn't built on a sustainable model. It's impossible. We can think about a lot of the cheap brands that we have, in our Westfields today. And if we were to go and shop with half of these brands, absolutely, we can guarantee that either someone or something, but usually both, is being exploited so that you can have that cheap product. And again, I believe that consumers have become the victims of this horrid crime, which is manipulative marketing for the sake of benefiting the brand, benefiting the benefactors of that brand. And so, that stems out of lots of issues which go into this need to be able to continue to grow for shareholders, especially publicly listed companies. And if the cycle is that we only measure the profitability of a company and that needs to continue to grow, then this problem will never die. But if we start measuring it in a wholesome way, in fact, the only way that we should measure, and in fact, our balance sheet should show the social, environmental, and economic outcomes of a business. But unfortunately, nobody has a good measure of that yet. Nobody knows how to even present that well yet. How do you even put a value to social outcomes in your business? And so if we haven't invested into those things and worked out, trustworthy methodologies that sit beneath it, then it's going to be very difficult for any of us to change. But I guess that's what I'm really excited about, because I see so much movement in this space now that it's providing opportunity for those brainiacs that are going to be able to go and implement that stuff so that businesses like Outland Denim can really benefit from being able to show the real value of our company, which is based on a wholesome view.
That's awesome, James. And speaking of brainiacs, I'm just looking at the time because we want to make sure there's enough time for Q&A. So I'll just have a couple more questions and then we'll go into Q&A. But Richard, speaking of brainiacs, as James has clearly outlined, Outland is a business model to aspire to in the fashion industry and even in other industries as well. But this sustainable, ethical business model it's still a relatively niche segment. So in your perspective, what do you think we need to do to make this mainstream? Of course we need that mindset shift, but from a business perspective, how do we make this happen?
Yeah, that's a big question, Rebecca. I guess first of all, just to continue off where James stopped there, I think there are some very clear, simple business examples of where it is in people's interest to engage and to actually improve and to do well. And I mean, I was just literally talking to a company today, and they were talking about one of their suppliers that was in Asia, and it was a new brand or new supplier that they were bringing on. It was about 10 years ago now, but they've worked with that supplier, over those years to help them improve their processes, improve their practices, and that has obviously been good for the brand that I was talking to today, because it's built a strong working relationship with that supplier. They're getting great product, great quality, and that has benefited both parties. But then also that supplier is now servicing a number of Fortune 500 companies and has actually flourished in that environment. So I think there are some very clear, simple, core business examples that should be celebrated as well. And I think that's part of that education process. But for me, I think how to make it more mainstream, I think it's slightly changing the focus. And, again, we sort of heard greenwashing and the like thrown around today. And I think that's sort of part of the fundamental problem. For me, most brands out there are working hard to try and prove that there is no problem in their operations and their supply chain. And instead, I think the focus needs to shift to accepting that this problem is so massive, it is so prolific, so pervasive, that it's inevitable that it does exist. So you got to focus on finding it. And when you make that very small but very nuanced sort of change in your mindset, then it does change the game significantly. And, so instead of focusing all your time and effort on producing some audit reports and some paperwork and everything else, not saying that that's not important, and I think it is, and that's very important to sort of be able to demonstrate your intent and align values and expectations throughout your supply chain. But if you actually then take a step back and go, well, actually, if I was to think about this critically, where are the issues? Where are people most exposed? Where are the most vulnerable demographics in my supply chain? I'm going to understand that, and then I focus time and effort and resources to fix that. And I think it really does start to shift. And I can say that stakeholders are already there. And I personally believe, and Justine sort of was talking to this earlier, where she was saying, government, I think the legislation is incredibly important in shining a light on it and getting things moving. But then what I'm seeing now and what I believe is the future is that the financial markets will start to drive behaviour, and they already are. And they're holding people to account. Again, I was talking to a brand or a business a couple of days ago, and they sort of come to me and said, I've got an investor who's now come to me and said, you've been working on understanding your supply chain for 12 months. Why haven't you found any instances of modern slavery in your supply chain? And that's exciting, because that's the different metric. That's what we want. That's what we want investors to be asking. They don't want the 30-page report that they can, shove in the drawer and dust off next year. They want to understand, what are you doing about this? What are you, how are you creating impact? And if you're not finding it, you're obviously not doing something well. And so that is the shift change that I think will come. And I think we're already seeing it. I saw Boohoo got an F on the report there. They were exposed for issues last year, I think it was now, and they took a 30% share price hit overnight. And that has rebounded since, but it's that sort of action, and I think you'll see, I think you'll see the financial markets driving behaviour in those instances, calling out instances of exploitation and demanding better behaviour from brands that they've invested directly into. So I think that's the driver from my perspective.
That's such a good point, Richard. Like, this issue is so pervasive. It's almost like we can't kid ourselves. It's in the supply chain. People are being, subjected to exploitation. So let's find it and fix it, instead of pretending or glossing over with an A+ rating when that's really not the case. And I see the amazing Kalpona's back, and I can see lots of questions coming in for her for the Q&A. So I just wanted to maybe just have one last question for Justine, speaking on the investment perspective. We're seeing with the sustainability movement and climate change, as investors are shifting massively in droves, and there's a lot of pressure on them. Do you agree with Richard in the sense that investors are moving fast enough to address modern slavery?
I think Richard's right that investors are key in pushing this movement. He probably has a little bit more faith in capitalism than I do, but I do think that, investors and business, but what I'm often seeing is that investors react. And so there are definitely examples where he said where they are being proactive, but they more commonly react. So, your classic example might be Rio Tinto and Yukon Gorge. After the fact that there was this failure to consult with the Indigenous community in Australia, and we saw the destruction of Yukon Gorge, then the investors came in hard. We saw a change of leadership within the company, which is fantastic. But at the same time, the investors have been pouring money into Rio for years and every other fossil fuel company out there. So they do have this leverage, and they have it on fashion, but they have it on, particularly in climate at the moment. It's still somewhat more niche than mainstream. I think their power is really important, because that's what business listens to more than government, more than consumers. They want the money. So I think but I think we also have to educate investors. So most guys who are, and they tend to still be guys, mostly in these investment firms, tend to not have any idea about rights, labor rights, human rights, modern slavery, etc. So there's this process of education that's happening, which is fantastic that you're running this seminar in a business school, and there's some other business schools who are doing it as well. But I don't also expect that every financial wizard now all of a sudden to be a human rights expert. So it'd be nice if they also have humility and reach out to people who know about these stuff, so to get that input. And so I think they have a real role to play. Are they moving fast enough? No. Because I also think they're part of the problem. They're creating the problem. They're investing in these major companies who are then exploiting it. When we sort of say you find it in your supply chain, well, actually you're creating it in your supply chain by the supply chain relationships you're setting up, by a failure to pay a fair price for that product, which means the worker at the bottom of that supply chain doesn't receive a living wage. So it's not sort of a magical, where is it in my supply chain? I'm creating the problem by entering those contracts first with my tier one supplier, and then that cascades down the supply chain by not having a business model that allows a fair product to be paid, fair price to be paid for that product. So it's finding it, yeah, but mostly it's first stop creating the problem, and investors are also creating that problem. So they're both part of the problem and part of the solution.
Exactly. And that's what we need to hear, Justine. Here. I see Kalpona's nodding her head. So I want to go to the Q&A questions. I'm just looking at time. We'll probably have questions for the next 20 minutes or so before we wrap up. So keep an eye out on Slido. If you have any other questions to ask, just send them through. But I've got one here for Kalpona. Speaking of solutions, are there any examples where businesses actually did the right thing during the COVID crisis in Bangladesh? Because as you mentioned in the beginning, effectively a lot of Bangladeshi garment manufacturers were facing, serious humanitarian crisis because they weren't getting paid and the companies pulled out of their contracts. So were there any companies who were like, okay, we're gonna cop it here and we're gonna make sure that the workers are looked after because you've been working for us for so many years? Were there any companies?
Yeah, very unlikely. There are few. Was H&M.
No, I think we've lost her again.
Orders. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You said something about H&M.
Yeah. So yeah, it was
We can't hear her now.
Giving living wage, but never did. But during COVID, they have been,
Okay. Kalpona,
not.
I think you're cutting out a little bit. Maybe if you turn your camera off, it might help.
Okay. How about now?
We can hear you. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, when I'm facing internet and electricity problem in the same time. So anyways, okay. So what I said that H&M was the company who said that they will be not reducing or canceling their orders, and they paid their bill on time. So it was very unlikely for H&M to doing this because they have made many promises in the previous, like paying workers living wage within 5 years, but they did not. But it was very, very, fortunate that they step up and they said they will be not constantly, canceling the order. So this is one company that I can name up.
That's good to hear that H&M is doing something positive in that area. So I've got a question here for Justine. I think this is a good one for you. Of course, we're from business school students, and there's various people from industry here, but we're also consumers as well. And the questions around like, how can we take it as an individual, take an impact or make an impact on advancing the law in Australia around this issue?
So go and work for companies where you then look at purpose-driven practices. So that's a very strong, way that you approach it. And you don't have to find that, the one Outland Denim, but you want to go into companies that perhaps are not doing it and then start to change their practices as well. Though, of course, you should also work for Outland Denim. But in terms of the thing that I think you can do both as consumers and in business is ask questions. So in many of the companies around Australia, there are increasingly, particularly the large companies, there's sustainability people, there's sustainability departments, and there's some great people in these businesses. But a lot of the time, they're also fighting to be heard within their own businesses. So they need basically support from the outside to basically say, our consumers care about this. We're getting questions about this, or people are writing to us. A lot of the time, what I'll do is I'll often follow a lot of companies on social media and go and ask questions. So I'm like, oh, that looks, I really like that skirt. Do you know where it came from? Can you tell me where it is? I mean, I don't really want to buy the skirt, but then it basically goes back to them and says, people are asking us about the origin of this. And so I think it's the more we raise questions, there'll be an inquiry next year by the Australian government about the effectiveness of the Modern Slavery Act. Anyone can make submissions into that to say, you know what, you've had this act for 3 years and I've heard nothing about it, or I haven't seen any impact. But it's basically raising your voice, and it can be done in lots of different ways, directly to the company. You can write to your local member, but good old fashioned, sort of asking companies where things come from in their supply chain then builds up this culture of understanding that people care and that companies have to put money into these sustainable practices.
I can see, Kalpona, you've got your hand up. Do you have a perspective on this in terms of what individuals can do to shift and make a change?
Yes, I mean, I cannot agree more what Justin was saying. This is what we always tell to the consumers, right? Just don't go for the color, design, and price tag. Do more. I mean, when you are in the store, start asking questions from there. That ask store.
She's going to come back, Kalpona.
Manager, that you wanted to know more about this. Yeah, I mean, you wanted to know about more about these workers who are making clothes for you. You wanted to know how they are being treated, how much they have been paid. That definitely will ring a bell in the boss's office. I mean, other word, what Justin just said, that will give you opportunity for those working in the fashion industry to tell their bosses that this is what we are hearing from the consumers. So, I mean, if we don't raise our voice, the noise will be not make and our voice will be not heard. So asking question is really helpful.
I've got another question for you, Kalpona, and I'm going to read this question out directly. Let me know if you need me to clarify, but is there evidence that local business owners are telling Western brands, so local manufacturers in say Bangladesh, are telling Western companies that their wages, working hours, and conditions are better than they actually are?
I mean, I'm not sure. Is they say that, I mean, what is the reality they're giving, I mean, telling different to the brands?
I think so. I mean, I've come across this in some of the reporting I've done back in the day when I was in Indonesia, and a lot of the factory owners would actually tell the companies overseas that they were abiding by local law and paying the workers fairly.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, when they actually weren't, because they wanted
absolutely. I mean, these manufacturers are fabricated the documents. They have like two set of documents, one for them and one to show the brands or their auditors. But interestingly, many of the brands, they have their local offices here or local representative here. What exactly they do? Or the auditing company, I mean, traditional auditing, that letting management know that you are coming to the factory and then asking management to handpick the workers and questioning them, you will never get the truth. So yes, the manufacturers definitely tell the different story to the brands to get the orders. Like they will be never telling that our workers working 14-hour shift. They will be saying, oh, it is 8 hours and then 2 hours overtime, which is voluntary. But this is not close to the truth.
I've got another really good question here, and it'd be great to get a few of your perspectives on this, especially Kalpona in Bangladesh, and James, your experience in Cambodia. So the question is, there has been little conversation of local government roles in this problem. Surely there is work to be done there. James, do you have any experience working with the government in Cambodia on this?
No, we don't work with the government on anything that we're doing there. The government has made a lot of progress in Cambodia, a huge amount. For the garment sector, their minimum wage is getting very close to living wages now. So, and that's because they're trying to attract this kind of business, which is fantastic. But when I started in Cambodia 10 years ago, a minimum wage was about $40 US. So it absolutely meant that you were trapped in poverty.
And Kalpona, like, how is the government in Bangladesh helping to hopefully improve the situation for workers? Is that the case?
No, I mean, we have very steep space in here, right? Because, there is a collusion between the business and politics. So, or another word, as I said, that our legislator is our factory owner. So they don't do anything. I mean, even if there is no massive movement across the industry, they will be not even review the minimum wage. So, and until they get any international pressure, nothing changes here, because they themselves are more powerful. There is no one in the parliament who will be, speaking on behalf of the workers. So those shortfall are in here. So working with government, it is pretty challenging here, but, we are not sitting down. We are trying every day, though. In order to doing that, we are facing criminal charges. I was in prison for a month. I lost one of my co-worker who brutally tortured and, beaten to death. So all this happens, but, these workers and the activists in here are brave enough to constantly asking the, government to change the policies. After the many, especially there is a pressure from the global unions and ILO. So our labor law has been reviewed, but it is become kind of like management law rather than a workers' law. So whenever changes, it is not focused, the word not labor focused. It is always like business focused changes that's happened. So the space really is stiff. It is difficult to work in here.
But Rebecca, I might just add to that in Cambodia. I mean, Cambodia was sort of in many ways, the Bangladesh of the 1990s. And then there was a trade agreement that was put in place between US and Cambodia in the late 1990s, where basically tied trade quotas to working conditions in factories in Cambodia. And there's lots of critiques and lots of problems with the way it was done, but it was a force for Cambodian factories basically saying our whole US market is going to be cut off unless we start to improve. Then the International Labour Organization, ILO, also moved in. So it didn't magically change factories in Cambodia overnight. It's taken decades to, get to a better standard. But there is a role there for government and trade and law as well that is not the answer by itself, but it can have a serious impact.
And I think there's also, correct me if I'm wrong, but a role for business as well to appreciate that the laws are changing locally and to endorse that. Because what I heard on the ground in Indonesia when I used to work there was this fear from factory owners that, if they did advocate for, higher wages and higher prices for their product, and they were afraid that the company would just choose the next country, basically a race to the bottom to find, cheaper places to produce these goods. So would you agree with that, Justine? It's also about the companies genuinely having a commitment to say we're going to make sure that we'll keep the contracts in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's what both James and Richard were saying earlier on about, don't cut and run, stay. But it's, it's probably in some ways it's much more nuanced than that, and depends on the sector. So, the garment sector is a lower setup cost in terms of capital production than, say, an electronics factory, where the equipment can be quite different, or a joint venture in a mining, where you can't move it around. So there's sector by sector in terms of how much a company is forced to stay versus its choice. But something like garment, I mean, we've seen around the world, we've seen Ethiopia become very much, a focus of many companies have moved in there. And Ethiopia, I think at the moment, has the world's lowest wage for garment workers. in the world, because that was seen as the next place that was still on the radar. And the Ethiopian government deliberately marketed their factories as providing cheap labor. So you do see this movement around, and there is now more pressure on companies to stay than cut and run. But, you know, that's very different from a brand that has quality and reputation attached to it versus, they say, a large Walmart, which is really built more on price than quality.
Just keeping an eye on the time, and I appreciate everyone. It's the evening for you. So I'd just like to kind of ask each of our panelists just to give their kind of concluding remarks, and hopefully around the idea of, you know, leaving us with an idea of like, there are solutions to these. And if you could kind of give us something quite specific around your call to action specifically for the people on this call, especially the business students, as you know, in 6 months' time, we're going to be graduating and going off into industry. What's your call to action for us? Maybe we could start with Richard. Do you have, you know, your words of wisdom that you could impart?
Probably need a bit of time to think about that. I think it's just start, and you know, you talk to a lot of people, and it's a massive problem, very complex. It's almost overwhelming, but start somewhere and doing something, and you know, don't think you need to actually solve everything in the first day or week or year. And you look at the work that James and Justine and Kalpona have been talking about. You know, if you don't start, you're never going to actually achieve that change. And then I think from a business perspective, it's find commercially sustainable solutions for this stuff. And I firmly believe there are commercially sustainable solutions, and it has to be. Otherwise, you know, we see too many projects that start up and then die because the funding dies or it's not sustainable. So use the commercial levers for good and to create that change.
And James, what do we need to do to eradicate modern slavery once and for all?
It starts with you guys. It really does. I agree with Richard. You know, if you genuinely believe that it can happen, and I think that's a question that's actually good to contemplate, is can this happen, and what is my role in it? I mean, you guys are all going into the right sector to be able to create, you know, generational change, you know, change history. And every part of me believes that the business sector, that this is the area that it's going to come from, because we have so much control over what we should expect from our entire supply chain, and then what we can provide to those who are going to support our businesses. And ultimately, if we're not going to add something good to the world, then we shouldn't be in it at all. And so when you go and choose the workplaces you're going to work or the businesses you're going to start, think about it in that way. Does this actually leave the world in a better position as a result of me being here or not? And if it's a no, then move on to the next one, because there's so many opportunities for good people with the skills that you guys now have to go and change the world.
Thank you, James. And I've got a great comment from Jenny in here. Everyone send some money to Kalpona's amazing organization to make sure her work is sustainable. And I think this is a great way that we can conclude with you, Kalpona. Like, how can we make sure that workers throughout the entire supply chain are empowered with the knowledge around what their rights are? Like, what can we do to improve the situation?
Keep talking about these issues, you know, keep alive these issues and do the action. There is already examples said it, like I'll be not talking about in detail, but I'll request you guys to visit International Accord website, Clean Clothes Campaign, Workers Consortium, and Industrial Global Union. So you will be find a lot of, you know, information about how Accord has made difference here, and now working, you know, another geographical area with a new scope. So that will give you a great idea to understand that enforceable brand agreement can make changes. And a strong example is there. So in that case, you know, we can bring this enforceable agreement in area of living wage, in area of many issues. And the one other thing that is crucial that consumers need to do, I know James has spoke that in the beginning, that switch yourself to sustainable clothes than a fast fashion. Because the fast fashion is not helping anyone, not helping workers, not helping you as in consumers, and not helping our Mother Earth or our ecological system. Like if you come to Bangladesh in summer, you will see that half of the country are not having drinking water. is because we already used them for making clothes. For a t-shirt, its minimum need is 14 liters of water. Just think about the jeans, think about all these other stuff that we make, million of pieces that we make. Do we really need that many clothes? Can we wash them and reuse them? So think about it. And when you are using sustainable clothes, but make sure to pay enough. And also it is your accountability to also make sure that to see that a fair share goes to the workers, so workers have a living wage and better life. So this is what exactly the actions that we need to do. And precisely that read the ECHO document that will give you billions of ideas that how world can be changes.
Thank you so much, Kalpona, and I'll organize a follow-up email in the next few days and make sure that everyone has a link to your organization so we can learn more about the amazing and essential work that you do. Justine, I'd love to give you the last word here. Like, what's your final piece of wisdom for the business students on this call, and other people as well from NGOs and the industry that are joining us tonight?
Sure. I think that, to reiterate what I said before, is to continue to be curious. So ask questions, raise your voice, and figure out, how you actually can find out what's going on, not only in your own workplace, but further abroad. And it's like James said, you don't have to, it's very daunting to try and change the world, but you can create ripples where you start to ask questions, you support the work of others. And, you might be the Greta Thunberg of the area, or you might be a lot of people around her who are supporting her, and everybody else plays a valuable role. So as going into business, I think, by attending this session, it shows you've got a great interest. So I applaud you for that. So just continue the great work.
I also love what you said before about the fact that we actually do need to go work in companies that aren't perfect, because that's the whole point. We need to fix them. So
yeah, maybe not fossil fuel companies, but yeah.
Maybe not. I think it was a good point. So now, just to conclude, I'm really excited to hand over to our incredible Nikki, who is the Director of Community and Wellbeing for our Student Association. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I'll hand over to Nikki to give us her final remarks.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, panelists, for being so generous with your experiences and your knowledge this evening. I think for many of us or a few of us on the call, whether this is the first time we've kind of learned about modern slavery, or the second or the third, or further exposure, us as the hosts, hope this has been an insightful discussion for you all. There have been many nuggets of gold from all the from all our panelists this evening, and I thought I would like to share some of the key insights that I found and that I have absorbed. I think number one, not buying is really not the solution. The solution is looking after the workers that are providing us with these goods, treating them with dignity and paying them a minimum living wage. The second insight that I was able to absorb was the fact that this is a tricky space, but measuring the value of social outcomes is something really new and really difficult for a lot of businesses. But there is positive momentum that James has shared with us, and it's also important to remember that even though there are unintended consequences that might be a negative consequence, it is important to remember to keep just trying new things, because some good will come out of that negative. And as a consumer, re-educating ourselves, or even just educating ourselves, is a great first step. I'm not sure about you guys, but quite often when I go into a store to buy something, I don't want to be hassled by the retailer or the retail assistant that's on shift. It can really be as simple as asking the question of, where does this product come from? Because by generating that noise on the ground, the people that are up high making those key decisions will realize that this is something that's actually really important to their consumers, the people that are paying them that money and generating them that profit. And finally, as our MBA course is currently teaching us, responsible management does extend beyond the senior leadership team. So even when we're making a career decision now, or in 6 months when we graduate, we should be considering organizations that are responsible, or at least willing to be responsible to the entire stakeholder group and not just their shareholders. So you may ask, what can you do right now? As a start, we've compiled some resources for you that Jono will now share in the chat box, and we'll also share via email after this event. We really encourage you to check them out because, like we said, education really is the first step in this issue. Thank you again to Kalpona, to Justine, Richard and James for joining us this evening. We hope you've all had an informative and wonderful time with us, but more importantly, we hope that you feel equipped and empowered to play your part in tackling the issue of modern slavery in your organisation, as well as your choices that you make today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.